Good morning to everyone and welcome to History Matters, and so does coffee always. Today we're going to talk about, there's an mug, a topic that occurred to me. Oops, as ever, I have to remember to turn off chat or else I'll get totally distracted by you guys. What I want to talk about was inspired by something I was watching on TV yesterday, which I'll come back to shortly. The general idea is, what happens when your past becomes history, right? What happens when suddenly the things that are just part of your life are seen as history? And as I was saying a few minutes ago to Annie, those of us who are here who happen to be teachers, we face this all the time because you make a throwaway cultural reference or say something in class without thinking about it. And there's, these students weren't alive when the period you're talking about. And so you say something and then they respond and there's like a moment, or certainly for me, it's like, wait, what? How old am I? But at any rate, before we delve into that topic and what it means, which is really what I want to discuss, I turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who will explain the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Annie Evans from New American History at the University of Richmond, and I am, as I am always Friday, delighted to be here. Today's topic especially intrigues me, and we love the robust chat that we have going on here on Zoom and those of you on Facebook. But in the end, it's all about the Q&A at the end. So how this works is, as Joanne's talking, you're going to have lots of great questions. Put those in the Q&A, and in about 30 minutes, we will bring some of those up and hopefully get some answers. So take it away, Joanne. We are excited about this topic.
Hey, excellent. So I want to start out, before I even get into the topic of what happens when your past becomes history. I want to make clear that what we're not going to be talking about this morning is nostalgia, which is a different thing, right? So nostalgia is kind of a sentimental longing for the past, very emotion laden. And although that's an interesting topic in and of itself, what I'm really interested in talking about today is just the literal fact of when you realize at any given moment, because of something you see or read or something someone says, that a big chunk of your life is now seen as history. And what does that mean? How does that change the way you understand yourself? How does that change the way you understand not just your past, but the past and history generally? And in the fact, for those of us who are here in the United States and are remembering pasts in the United States, how does that shape our understanding of our nation and change over time? I'm going to come back to that idea shortly. I do want to mention what set me off, and I'm going to loop back to this at the end. So what I was watching, and I haven't watched enough of it to have an opinion on it yet, so I'm not, there's no thumbs up or thumbs down, but it's on, I believe, Apple TV, and it's a series, maybe 2 seasons, called Physical. I don't know if any of you have noticed it, but it's about the rise of the aerobics movement, whatever you want to call it, fad movements, more than a fad, in the 80s. Takes place in Southern California in the 80s. And I kind of vaguely knew that that's what it was about. But as I'm watching it, I lived in Southern California in the 80s, and I was smack in the middle of the rise of that culture, including going to Jane Fonda's workout and occasionally having Jane Fonda in Jane Fonda's workout while I was working out. So I'm watching this, and all of a sudden I had a very strong response, and that's what led to this topic, because I don't want to say it surprised me, but it recalled things, I guess, that I didn't remember about that period until I was having it brought back to me visually in this way. That's what gave rise to this topic. That when you are able to see your past from something of a distance, and that's meant to be a deliberately amorphous kind of term, but when you can, when you're, as I said in my announcement of this online, if you're lucky enough to live long enough to be able to see your past with some degree of detachment, on the one hand, you can see change over time. On the other hand, you are reminded of the things that built you up to where you are, and I think of the ways in which you fit into your time. Right? All of this cycling through my head. Historian brain was very active last night when I started watching this series, I guess because it surprised me. I don't know what I thought, but I didn't assume that it would basically be about my experience in Southern California, for better and often worse. So that's what I want to talk about. And as I often do, I want to start by talking about the founding generation, because there's a generation of people whose youth, whose 20s, was the revolution, right? So there's a group of people, unlike me, like suddenly being like, the 80s now is far enough ago, it's 40 years ago, that it has become history in some way, and you can stand back and look at it with detachment and draw conclusions about the United States, where it was and where it is now, and where you were, where you are now. The founding generation never had a doubt. They didn't know what the outcome would be, but they certainly knew that engaging in a revolution and then having engaged in a revolution was historic in every sense of the word. What's interesting is when that became not just true, but also personal. So at the end of the revolution, you're beginning to get people who are thinking about the fact that something historic may have just happened. In the early 19th century, you begin to get the creation of historical societies, right? Suddenly people are like, hey, the United States has a history, like it's been around, the government's been around for a little over 10 years, like woohoo, that should be accounted for, that should be thought about. And I know I've talked about William Plumer before from New Hampshire, who decides he's going to be the first person to write the history of the government of the United States. And he's collecting papers from the lumber room in the Capitol. He's in Congress and interviewing people around him who were part of the creation of the government. So he interviews Jefferson. He, talks to actually John Quincy Adams. He's doing, in a sense, historical research. But you can see in his writing about what he's doing that he's had this realization that there's a history and it happened and now it's historic and needs to be remembered, even though, he lived through that in addition to any other number of people who did. Suddenly it takes on a different kind of significance. Now, on a personal level, for the people who were engaged in the fighting of, or the organization of, or the paper creation of the revolution, when they get to their old age, not only do they have an understanding that their youth now truly is history, I've talked about this before too, they begin to understand the fact that they are seen as founders because something was founded, and they're reckoning with that. But what's always been striking to me is the degree to which their association with the revolution stays with them, not just among others, which it does, but to them becomes the significant era of their life, not just their youth, right? So many of them, like Hamilton, was very young when he took part in the revolution. So to some degree, these are men in older age who are thinking back to when they were young and taking part in this revolution, and the stakes were high and they were doing something that hadn't been done in this way before, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So of course, it's going to loom large, but it looms large in their lives as well. And the extreme example of this, which I always find striking, and I talked about one part of this story and not the other part. I think I've talked before about descriptions of Thomas Jefferson's death and in 1826. And he was drifting in and out of consciousness. And when he would regain consciousness, he would ask, is it the 4th yet? Is it the 4th yet? So clearly he wanted to die on the 4th of July. He was staging, in that sense, his death, right? That is the date he wanted to die. So in and of itself, that's interesting. But more along the lines of what we're talking about today, apparently when he was sort of in semi-consciousness, what he was mumbling about to himself was committees of correspondence. And, he was in the revolution in his sort of semi-conscious state. As he lay dying, that's where his mind took him back to that moment where, unquestionably the stakes had been high, the meaning of what they were doing, he now knew what that meaning was. So he, on a personal level, was experiencing and processing what happened as history, but that shaped who he felt he was as a person too. It shaped certainly how he, not necessarily while he's dying, but what he went through in the 1770s certainly would shape what he believed the United States should be, would be, was supposed to be, wasn't in later years. Those early years, the more they became seen as history, in a sense, the more vital it became to that generation to stay true to what they believed to be true of that early period. So in a sense, they were doing some of what I'm going to be talking about now, and I'm sure when questions come, we'll be talking about it too. The past was significant to them and others. It played a major role in their sense of self, and it was a pretty dramatic way of showing change over time. They could think about what they thought during that period and what they were assuming would happen and what they were hoping would happen and where the United States was. And now they could look 30, 40 years later and see where the nation was and either celebrate that or mourn that. And different founders in their final years did one or the other. The person who appears to, I believe, to me, to have been most complacent about where things were, and this is not surprising, it's James Madison, who believed well, now let's see where we go. That Jefferson was mourning the state of the nation because of slavery. Hamilton was mourning the state of the nation because of democracy. Everyone was addressing what the nation had become and the ways in which it wasn't what they wanted. And they were clinging to and going back to this period when it was all possibility that also happened to coincide with their youth. The same was true. It's not just Jefferson. Jefferson has the dramatic, as I'm dying, I'm in the revolution moment. Actually, it reminds me, John Adams gets really, in one letter, really angry. It's to Benjamin Rush, a letter to Benjamin Rush. And he's angry because everyone will remember Jefferson and not Adams about the revolution. Why? Because what they will remember is Thomas Jefferson sitting at a table, the lone man in the room, writing the Declaration of Independence. And John Adams says, Jefferson has the whole theater of the business. And that's his phrase, the theater of the business. He's got it all. That's what people are going to remember, is the theater of the business. I don't have any theater of the business, right? That's John Adams' eternal Rodney Dangerfield. I don't get no respect. He's that guy in the founding. But at any rate, the larger point is the meaning that people get from the past. Jefferson's not the only one. Hamilton, apparently, when he's a father, and he the only home he owned in his lifetime was the Hamilton Grange, which is now up in the 140s here in New York. It was a country home. Other than that, he was a renter, like many of the rest of us. But once he had that summer home, according to his sons, he liked being outside with the kids, playing with the kids outside. And one of the things that he would teach them to do was march like soldiers. March like when he was a soldier. Here's how you march, kids. So in that sense, even he, in some way, was going back in time to this time when, he was a soldier and everything was noble and he felt brave and important. And again, the personal and the national melding in some way, in this case, in a kind of sweet way. I suppose you might even say there's some nostalgia there, but the same idea that these, that's probably 2 or 3 years before he dies. And that's, what he's now living with his kids. Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr had a heroic moment during the revolution, early in the revolution, where he went actually to Quebec with troops led, I think, by Benedict Arnold, and Richard Montgomery had captured Quebec. I think Burr was going to escort with Arnold and the troops them back from Quebec now that they had won it. And Montgomery ends up getting shot and killed in the surroundings of Quebec. And Burr is the guy who rushes on to the battlefield and saves the corpse of the general. Right. This is seen as high heroics. And the reason I mention this is because in his later years, when he has not become governor of New York, and he was a one-term vice president because Jefferson didn't trust him, he then goes out west to see what he can get out west. Maybe I can make my own empire, whatever it is he's doing out west. Another episode. Apparently, there was a group of young men following him as followers to take part in what he was doing because they saw him as a hero of the revolution. He became a national hero with that action in the Quebec campaign, and that became part of his identity. And certainly, if these young men are flocking after him because he was, a hero of the revolution in that way, you have to know this wasn't like something that people murmured about. This was some part of his reputation that he was proud of. For all we know, he talked of it. He certainly, in his memoirs, addressed his wartime career as being, a highlight of his life. Although his memoirs, I think I've talked about this before, his memoirs, they don't appear to be, they seem as though they're a biography of Burr written by his political lieutenant, Matthew Davis. And they are written by Davis, but Burr appears to have dictated part of it to Davis, which is a great example to me of some people in the past not reading the introduction closely enough. Like, oh, it's a biography. It's like, no, actually, Davis says, parts of this he dictated to me. So then it becomes more like a memoir. It's 2 volumes, and they break down into roughly, I hate Washington, I hate Hamilton, I hate Jefferson. That's a great oversimplification, but that's essentially what he's doing in this volume. But anyway, he, like Hamilton, like Jefferson, like Adams, like all the people who in one way or another experienced their youth in this climactic moment of the American Revolution, that became the way they judged everything that came after that. Sometimes consciously, sometimes not, but some of the ways and the fervor with which people were engaged in political combat in the 1790s is because in the 1790s, they were thinking back to what they thought the revolution was supposed to mean and how it was supposed to have certain outcomes. And what was happening in the 1790s when there was a national government was people were now beginning to process the fact that what they had thought was going to happen, or what they had hoped, maybe more accurately, was going to happen in the nation, to some degree might have been happening, and to some degree was definitely not happening. So what you see in the 1790s, in addition to people wrestling with the politics of the moment, is people wrestling with the history of the country, their youth, the revolution, and the promise, and everyone had their own sense of that promise, what it represented. So the 1790s, in a way, has a thread running through it that really consists of precisely what we're talking about this morning, which is the ways in which, your life becomes history. And in that sense, history becomes part of your life, becomes personal. You become bound up with that past in some ways. And it reveals things about the surroundings and how you generally, we define that we however you want to, a national we, a generational we, got to where we are, and how you personally got to where you are. Which brings me back to what I was watching yesterday, and the series of interesting, I don't want to say surprises, but sort of moments I had while I was watching it. So it and I should say, actually, I like to reference book. There's a book that just came out by Natalia Melman Petrozella, and I hope I'm saying her last name right, called Fit Nation. And it's explicitly about the rise of the fitness craze in the United States, just coming out now. I think she's on a book tour now. And she talks some, and I'm going to come back to some of what she says in a moment. I went to check into her book this morning once I knew about this topic and that TV show. So it's a TV show. And what I didn't expect, it's obviously has a hero in it, a young woman who is sort of finds herself into the rising aerobics craze. And certainly it's very clear on the series that no one knows what the heck really aerobics is or why you do it. And I think she tries at one point to explain to her mother what she's doing. And it's like training. And the mother's like, training for what? Like, what does it do? So it was interesting to go back to that moment. But what I saw in her character made me think about that period for me in a different way, made me think about that period in a different way. And then, as I'll come back in a moment, made me connect with some of what Natalia is saying about the rise of the fitness craze. What I saw was the main character getting this sense of herself, and the actress was doing a fine job of showing this, a sense of her strength and her power in a different way, right? Her physical strength, her power, her ability to do this really hard thing in front of a mirror where you're trying to, and hopefully do, look graceful while doing it, right? There was a sense of power in the ability to do what sometimes felt like, drill camp exercise set to music with beautiful people in leotards. But I remembered, I'm watching this and I'm watching, it's TV. So like the close up of her face, and she's sort of like, wow, I haven't felt like this before. And I thought, oh, that's exactly what I felt like. I felt like it gave you a sense of power associated with, in a sense, yourself as a woman and with your body in a way, and the strength of what you could do. I wasn't interested in that era in jazzercise or dancercise. I was interested in high impact, like kick you in the teeth kind of aerobics, really hard. And I wanted it to be really hard because when I could do it, that somehow gave me this sense of strength and control, which that character at one point says comes out of her mouth later on in that series. So what's interesting is, I've talked before, even on my previous podcast, there was an episode we did, I think, on fitness, and I talked a little bit about being of the exact right age to be right there as it was rising and people were beginning to go crazy over it. That I've understood before. What I hadn't focused on before was the way in which that says a lot about how I had been feeling before that point, that I kind of hadn't taken possession in some ways of my strength and my body. I probably hadn't thought about my body as anything other than something that's supposed to look nice. It was an important moment for me, and lots of other people were having that same moment, which brings us back to Fit Nation. So in the book, she talks about how it's the 1980s when you begin to have and these are her thoughts, a consensus that everyone should be doing some form of exercise. And she says it's partly the result of the women's movement of the 1960s and 1970s, which fought for Title IX, which then allowed girls to play school sports, pushing back all of that on the idea that girls and women somehow couldn't do vigorous exercise because they're fragile, or they would become like men, or they would look like men, all of the things that people might have said about why this shouldn't be happening. Now, what's interesting is and this is a great example of why it's important not just to think about the events of history, but to focus on the whys and hows. She talks about how when she began this book, she was looking at the early 20th century, and there were fitness enthusiasts in the early 20th century. It was another period of this. And she said she found a lot of talk of it was important for women to be fit. There shouldn't be corsets being worn anymore. They were an assault on a woman's form, that women should be lifting weights, that women should be stronger. The early 20th century, and again, this is all her thoughts, so this is not me, she is speaking. She said when she discovered this, she felt like it was so progressive. Then she said she kept reading and she realized this was about white women building up their strength because they needed to be more white babies because of the rise of immigration, and because you were beginning to see formerly enslaved people and the legacy of the freedom of those people beginning to appear. So to her surprise and in some ways horror, she discovered that this early 20th century fitness craze was actually a white supremacy. This is what she calls it, a white supremacy project. She calls it a, quote, holy crap moment as a historian, where you do this kind of research and you see that this thing that in many ways is similar to something that was part of your life has this other dimension to it, which you hadn't thought about before, which then should, if we're all historians in some way, lead us to think about what it means going forward, what it means in more recent times, and how it might be shaping our understanding of ourselves and our times and the recent past today. So I guess part of my overall point here, because I see we're running out of time, I think understanding this simple fact that when your youth or some part of your life, doesn't even have to be your youth, an earlier part of your life becomes history, becomes a period that people see as the past in a distinctive way, not like, 5 years ago, but, the 60s. We tend to do that with decades, right? 70s, the 80s. We probably moved on to the 90s at this point. At any rate, when you begin to see a big chunk of your life as history, it's worth thinking about what that gives you. You can do that with a certain amount of detachment. So one thing that it gives you is the ability to take a step back and say, oh, like that, there I was in that moment, in that time. And what did it feel like to be in that moment? And what was the United States or the world like in that moment? And what did I assume about the world and about myself in that moment? And how has that changed over time? Right? When some part of your life becomes history, that's a perfect setup to understand the thing that's really at the core of the study of history, which is change over time. What changes, right? When you certainly in my case, when I've started some kind of new project and I think about like, where do I start? One of the things I think of is, well, this is the behavior I'm interested in. When does it stop? Right? When is the change? When does it start? When does it stop? When is there change? Because the change will tell me something about what was happening, because I'll understand what, I'll have to understand what made it stop or what made it start. So thinking of your life that way, I think offers all kinds of interesting insights into your life, your times, our lives. That thought about how empowering it felt to do that exercise, which I don't think I'd ever thought about before, definitely makes me think on a personal level about the different ways in which I thought about being a woman and what was important about being a woman over the decades then and thereafter, and what the nation has been saying about that as well, and what that suggests about what Americans see as an ideal, in some ways, American. There's clearly an economic basis in this particular subject and that's, I believe, what the book goes on to talk about is fitness becomes a consumer enterprise, and you buy crazy expensive things and you're spending lots of money, but you seem virtuous for doing it. And so it feels okay to spend all that money because you're doing a good thing. I have not read the book yet, but I'm very interested in it. At any rate, thinking about the parts of your life that have become history, thinking about what they tell you about change over time, taking advantage of the perspective that you will have on that period and on what came after, that will be your perspective, that will connect with some broader things that historians are saying and will be different in some ways. And those differences matter, right? Those differences will inform you and about your world and will raise interesting questions as you're processing all of that. So I realize there's kind of sometimes a time warp feeling when you do this, like, wow, that was 40 years ago. How is that possible? That was 40 years ago. That's a long time. But I think the question to ask after you recover from the time warp feeling is, what does that tell me about how we got to where we are now? And I think your personal perspective on that means that you will have insights that other people will not necessarily have. It connects with the other idea that I keep encouraging people to take notes on the weirdness of this time, and particularly on the pandemic component, because on the one hand, in some ways, we're all experiencing some things together. In other ways, we're experiencing them in our own way, based on our personality and our particular fears and our particular hopes and our family and whatever else the things are. And your struggle with the pandemic will help show you how you got to where you will be down the road, but we'll say a lot about that moment too, in ways that you might not necessarily read in a book. Okay, I'm going to stop, and I think we're at mug time. I think I might have even beat mug. This is going to be an obvious one, and some of you may have already guessed it. So I'm now at the point when I pick the mug and I'm like, oh, they know this one. Oh, they're going to guess this one. So I
like repeat mugs.
This is a repeat mug that I'm very flattered by.
Oh, I love it.
Better Places, 1962.
That's a great mug.
Thank you. And this was, I know I've asked this before. Carolee, was it a group gift? Yes, Carolee. Okay. Thank you. I feel such guilt all the time. It's like, I can't remember the names of the people.
That's why we have a spreadsheet.
That's true. That's true. Anyway, so this happens like the ideal mug, right? Not necessarily that I'm making the world a better place, but
oh yeah, you are.
1962.
My mug would say causing trouble since 1962. Oh, that's so funny. Yes, okay. Carolee, I remember, because you help us keep that stuff straight. Thank goodness.
Someone
all right,
must do this.
Questions. I'm so excited. This is my favorite part of the day. All right. So our first question up comes from our friend Dale in Williamsburg, Virginia, not too far away from me. He says, with the Jefferson Adams letters, we know a fair bit about their thoughts on the revolution, but is there documented evidence about what Washington thought of the revolution and the new government?
Interesting. Well, I mean, let me back up, because the first thing that strikes me about Washington, and when you're asking this question, is he worked really, really hard, particularly when he was president, but I think often when he was general during the revolution, to not show his feelings, right? To be like the guy who's like, solid as a rock. You can't tell what he's thinking, and particularly as president, he didn't want to seem monarchical and like a king, but he needed to seem dignified, and somehow he found that middle ground. So you don't see him like in a room with people saying, oh yes, the revolutionary days. On the other hand, what reminded me, or certainly actually taught me, the degree to which that is the case is after he steps down from the presidency and we get into the quasi-war with France in the late 1790s, he suddenly, it becomes very clear, he's really a federalist, like really a federalist. Like he starts talking about how it's important to get more federalists in the Virginia legislature, and they need to be distributing the right kinds of pamphlets. And all of a sudden it's like, okay, like intellectually I might have known this, hadn't seen that guy before, hadn't noticed that guy before. So that's interesting, because it's certainly then, it's very clear during the revolution and afterwards, he thought an important lesson of the revolution had been there must be a stronger national government. One of the things the revolution taught a lot of people who were at the national headquarters of the war effort, meaning the war, not the Continental Congress, was actually that at Washington's headquarters, that Continental Congress was not strong enough to maintain, organize, and successfully carry out this war effort. So a lot of people came away from that, Washington's headquarters, being strong federalists. We need a stronger government. So certainly you can see that in his thinking. But he, I think, liked to play it kind of cool and felt that was his political duty and patriotic duty, to not muse in that way, in a careless manner, I guess is what I'll say.
Okay, that was a good one. So this is from our friend Bobby. She's asking, do you think the MTGs, Lauren Boebert, Mitch McConnell, Jared and Ivanka, 45, Jim Jordan, Matt Gaetz, Ron DeSantis are thinking about or care how the future will record their names in history books? Dare I mention George Santos or some of the newer Supreme Court justices?
So that's a really interesting question. And it's been raised on and off in our recent contentious times, because very often people say things like, history will teach them, right? History will show them, history will take its revenge, like it will expose these people for what they are. Maybe, I mean, I like to think that, but we don't know that. And so in part, I would think that given that we're living in times where even what you're doing in the immediate present in a very obvious way, you somehow seem to not be accountable for it, does not suggest that down the pike, you somehow are going to be held accountable in ways both positive and negative for what you've done. There are a lot of people, I think, now, particularly in politics, who just believe, well, you just control the record. And of course, the record is always controlled, but we're not, in a way, the history of something is a version of accountability, right? If you're accountable for something, it means you're seeing how it happened and who was to blame and the logic of how it played out. Now we're seeing people denying big chunks of history, denying any accountability for anything. Generally speaking, these are not people who are going to be thinking of how history sees them. They might be thinking of how they can make themselves be seen. That'll be a big part of what they're thinking about. And that's an interesting thing. And I don't like to talk about the founding generation as, like you were better than us. But one thing they thought about was posterity, in part because they were doing something that they wanted to have some kind of a future. So they were thinking about the impact of what they were doing in a way that people now don't necessarily have to, and many really don't. And that's connected with this as well. If you're focused on the right now and on who has power right now and who can get what they want right now, and the impact for you and your friends who have power or need power right now, generally speaking, you don't necessarily have to think about the long-term impact of anything or how history will see you. I was just reading this morning. I was very curious what happened when you Google, what was the question I asked? I think I even asked, like, what happens when your life becomes history, just to see, like, what comes up on Google when you do that. And I got a lot of things, not the particular one I was looking for. I got a lot of things. And I lost track of where I was going, actually. Just went right
when you Googled it.
Before, it was right, whatever I said right before that is where the Googling was aiming for. And now
you mentioned posterity because I made a note in the chat.
Okay.
The difference between nostalgia, history, and posterity. Like, that's a lesson right there. What do those three words mean?
That is very true. It's not going to come back. It will come back like in 3 hours.
Somebody will put it in the chat, or it'll come up in the after party. Keep going. It's great.
Yes. And I see someone mentioning, I see someone mentioning Myth America, which seems like, again, a really interesting book on this topic. I was going to be a part of it, and then I couldn't write the essay I needed to write in the time I had to write the essay, so I backed out. But seems like it would very much be worth picking up and reading along the lines of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, and when you said something about Googling it, my thought was, what would be the response to that question if you put it in Chat GPT? Because I attended a pretty interesting talk yesterday afternoon about Chat GPT.
Oh, interesting.
So before we always kids would say, oh, just Google it. Now they're like, oh, put it in Chat GPT. Chat GPT is the new.
I'm gonna have to learn clearly about this in a way.
Okay, our next question comes from our good friend Gloria. Hi, Gloria. She says, I was very young when JFK was inaugurated, but I remember feeling his address focused on a torch has been passed to a new generation, and I was grabbing the torch. Today's students see the Cold War, and I see the torch and change the world. Which is the meaning? How I saw it, or today's students?
Well, they're both the meaning, right? I mean, your sense of it and what it felt like to you is wonderful and hugely important, right? Because you were there. And the students will not be able to understand the emotion of that better than to hear that from you if you're a teacher. That said, the more detached view of standing back and talking about what it means or what it suggested, that's true too. Those things can be true at the same time, I guess. So like I could write, well, I couldn't, but let's say I could write a book about the 80s and exercise without talking about what it felt like to me. But adding that in, it makes me think of, I said something to my students about not having computers when I was in college, right? And my students were like, how did you write papers? How, so then I started talking about like staying up all night because you had to type, and then you halfway down the page, you make a mistake and you have to rip it out. And I went through all of the weirdnesses of that, which hadn't occurred to me as the weirdnesses they were until my students honestly couldn't understand how you can write a paper without a computer. At any rate, so I think your personal dimension matters profoundly. That's the sort of stuff I look for as a historian when I'm doing research. I need to know the facts. I need to know what happened. I need to know the broader patterns over time. But I'm looking for, in my last project, right, I was looking for members of Congress who confess their feelings, usually in letters to their wives is where they did it. That was huge, right? Because they would say things like, there are a lot of big guys here and it makes me nervous. That's, for a historian to understand that moment and what it felt like to be in Congress at that moment, that was important. So I think it's all important.
Yeah. Okay, so Dale has a couple of questions. I'm going to put one out here. He says, you mentioned a lot of founder fond memories, but what about founder regrets? Are there any notable founder regrets?
Oh, interesting. Founder regrets. I'm sure there were. I just have to think of them. Founder regrets. Well, I mean, in a general way, Hamilton was profoundly disappointed in the way things were going. And I think on some level, I don't think he necessarily felt he shouldn't have done what he did, but I don't think he felt that what he did had the outcome he wanted. There's a famous line from one of the letters he wrote in the last years of his life was, "This American world was not made for me." Just kind of profound for anyone we now deem a founder to say, but it was going in some weird direction and he thought he'd been doing one thing and he hadn't been doing it. Maybe he hadn't done enough. But more concrete regrets. I mean, what would be nice to see is a regret, and which doesn't appear to have been, is in Jefferson's old age, people coming forward and asking for him to say a word or two on freeing enslaved people, on the evils of slavery, and Jefferson saying, no, that's for the next generation, not me, and bowing out of that. People who have read those later letters in his life more than I have, I've read some of them, but some of them haven't come out yet in volumes, and I haven't read the microfilm, might know if he expressed any regret, but I'm not aware of any, of him being like, oh, if only I had done blah, blah, blah about slavery. Don't know about that. I think he truly felt like, down the road, that's something for young'uns down the road. And, we did what we could. So I'm sure there are concrete regrets that I'm not thinking of. I'm frantically flipping through the index cards in my brain and not thinking of it. I will keep that process going. And hopefully by the end, probably in the next 14 minutes, I will think of something more specific than what I just said.
I wonder if more modern presidents will look at gun control and climate change that way. They just
Climate change, you would
down the road to the next person, and it just kept getting worse and worse. I don't know.
It's hard. It's hard to imagine people not thinking that about climate change, right? To me, that there will be a point at which things get particularly irretrievably, very obviously bad, which some could argue is now, but let's pretend it isn't. And that people will then be able to look back and say, why didn't we? Why didn't we? Yeah, that's the hindsight is 2020.
Yeah. All right. Our friend Miriam asks us, how would this be applied to the teaching of history? Say, for example, in the UK, nothing was taught about trouble in Northern Ireland. In France, nothing was told about the unrest of the 60s. Teaching of history kind of stopped after World War II when I was in school, which is a good while back.
So the question is, how would this play out in England?
I think teaching history here, like she's using other examples, how other places, we just sort of don't, and that's true here in the United States.
Yeah,
Really that's World War II. So these things that we're now saying, like the fitness craze and all that,
right,
like,
right.
Not anything past World War II, hardly.
No, that's true. And I remember being in high school, and I think it pretty much we got up to World War II, and I remember thinking, but like things are going to keep happening. Like, how can we get them in the course? Right?
They want to know about the more current. They want to know about Vietnam. They want to know about, all the things that have happened. They want to know about the 80s, the 90s, 9/11. Yeah. So unless they take an elective in modern history, they don't get any of that.
No, it's true. And as we're seeing in Florida, it can thus be easy to blot out things like the fight for civil rights and the meaning of civil rights, what civil rights are, why we had to fight for them, and why they're important to protect. Right? That's a far away, but not certainly to me, not very far away past that. Even now is some people are trying to literally whitewash that away. And if it's not in the story that you tell about America, then you can ignore a lot of things. So no, for sure. That larger question about what we include and what we don't is pretty huge. And just as you're saying, students want to talk about, as a matter of fact, my creation, actually, I think in both my Age of Hamilton and Jefferson undergrad seminar and my Creation of the American Politician undergrad seminar, I now start it with a class I didn't used to before, which is, how do we think about the founders? Like, what do we make of the founders? How has that changed over time, and how should we think about it? Because students, we are in a moment, right, where people are talking about that all the time. So just to basically take a step out of the period and stand in the present and ask these kinds of questions, I think is important.
Yeah. Here in Charlottesville, kids have asked me, in 20 years and 30 years and 50 years, how will people remember Unite the Right? How will they talk about us and what happened that day?
Right.
So, and every community, has something that they wonder how that's going to be remembered. I hope it's not something as horrific as that. But anyway, we have
I'll say one thing while we're going on to the next question, but I will say there is another phenomenon that I wasn't talking about today, but that just is when something particularly traumatic or climactic happens, right? You remember precisely where you were when you heard it, right? We all have those moments, 9/11 or the Challenger exploding or, whatever. We remember where we were because those were moments where almost the opposite of what we're talking about now, right? Where you're not looking back and sort of having a time warp moment. You're having in the moment a sort of holy smoke. You're not thinking history just happened, but what you're thinking is this is big and I don't know what to do with it yet. And it has such a profound effect on you standing where you are in your world that you kind of remember where you're planted at that moment. In my revolution course, I talked to my students about how for some people, hearing the news of the British firing on colonists at Lexington and Concord, that was a moment like that for them. For other people, they remembered in later years the bells ringing when the Constitution was ratified, right? There are moments where it's like there's something big that happens. In the case of the British troops firing on their own colonists, that was the equivalent of some of the traumatic bad moments we remember. They couldn't process, like, how could that be happening? Those are our soldiers. Like, how does that make sense? Anyway, I will stop talking and open things up for more questions.
I don't know if you've ever seen that film Bobby about Bobby Kennedy's assassination, but it's kind of behind the scenes, what was going on with his team and his people. It's an interesting film. It didn't get a lot of it was a small film, but anyway. Okay, Cece has an interesting one. She says, we know it's true. People remember the same thing from the past very differently, sometimes shockingly very differently. In your research, Joanne, how often do you find two or more people describing the exact same event with totally different conflicting perspectives?
A lot. Well, and I'll qualify that. Newspapers, since in the periods that I study, were not seen as objective yet. The most dramatic thing I could research in newspapers and have no sense of what really happened, and would have to like work and piece it together and try and see what I could prove. Huge fight in Congress with scores of congressmen running at each other and punching each other in front of the speaker's platform in the House of Representatives. That's a huge event. The number of accounts I read of what happened and who was in it and how it played out and who got punched and who punched who, it took me a long time to figure that out, because there were no two accounts that were the same. And that's certainly true in a whole bunch of other ways. It's true, if you read the congressional record, that's not exactly what happened. But if you look at people's memoirs, and a lot of the people, my later period, the antebellum politicians, many of them write memoirs. You look at a couple memoirs, and if you're lucky enough to get some people remembering the same thing, as a matter of fact, the differences become really significant and useful, because you can now understand how these people want to be seen or how they remember it. And you then have to process to what degree are they performing and to what degree are they reflecting what they experienced. But the differences become useful, just like change over time. Change over time is one of those phrases. It's like, yeah, history is change over time. And we don't think about what that means in a profound way. What we're talking about today sort of hits that right on the head, right? That someone like me, 18 years old, in some studio with my little leotard, sort of doing my thing and looking in the mirror and being like, wow, like I'm strong, and where I am now, and what I couldn't take for granted then and what I do now, that change over time in my life feels pretty major. We all have those kinds of moments. Funniest thing to me is that when I was writing this book, I tended to put Post-it notes in front of me to remind me of the important things I needed to bear in mind. And I had one that said, Congress matters, which was there because you write something for 17 years and you begin to wonder, like, does this really matter? It's like, no, Congress really matters. And the other one said, and I think I saved it, change over time. Like, very important historical insight. But I had to remind myself, like, don't just look at the moment you're looking at, right? Think about what changed over time. I just think that was the most comical thing that I had to remind myself.
Yeah, and I love what Clinton just wrote in the chat. He said that type of analysis is what I look for when I read a historian.
Yeah.
Hi, buddy Clinton. I miss you, Clinton. We had so much fun at AHA. Okay, so Dale asks, he says, Gordon Wood often mentioned the idea of politicians of the founding era being disinterested, as in putting their country before personal ambition. Can we apply disinterested to anyone political life today?
Well, first of all, I don't think they were all disinterested. I think some were. I don't think they all were. And I think I don't like the idea of assuming that somehow that generation was superhuman and better than us and put their country before themselves all the time. And they weren't a people apart, and they didn't want to be seen as a people apart. And that wasn't the kind of government that they created. So I think to really understand the creation of the government and the flaws in it, you have to allow the interest, right? It's there. Different people, different ways, different degrees. But that said, the larger idea that there were some people who were more dedicated in some ways to thinking broadly, thinking about posterity, thinking about the larger good. Certainly there were many. I would put the Adamses in that camp, right? John and John Quincy Adams. Generally, it's hard to see what they're doing that's self-interested, other than the fact that, they wanted to be president or they wanted to be whatever, the personal degree, but they didn't there's a reason why they're the only one-term presidents in the entire founding generation, because they didn't do what their parties wanted them to do. They didn't do necessarily the things that would get them power and support. They did the things that they thought were the best to be done. And again, sometimes maybe they weren't the best to be done, and sometimes in some way they were maybe serving themselves. But the reason why they were one-termers is because they weren't playing the party game. They were thinking in some other way. There's a letter I found in the first Congress, and John Adams, he's vice president, he's presiding over the Senate, and it's a letter from one member of the Senate, I think someone back home, and he says, Adams, I mean, he doesn't like cooperate with anybody. He's like doing his own thing, coming up with his own ideas and like following them and not cooperating. And he's just kind of out on his own doing what he thinks best. And the other person writes back and he's like, isn't that what we want them to do? And thus I've remembered that exchange for many decades, because that's precisely true, right? That is what we want them to do. And yet if you do that, you might not succeed in politics.
Yeah. All right. We got 2 minutes. We've got 2 questions.
We can do this.
One from Dave. He says, I was in elementary school when JFK was assassinated, high school for Kent State and Watergate. What I remember about those historical events has deepened and changed as I read about them later as an adult. For example, Hoover and the FBI, he mentions the book G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover. He said, is some of this change in me the difference between history and historiography?
Well, so some of the change is definitely, I think a bunch of things, right? So some of it is you and what you've seen and experienced and read over time and how that's going to shape your perspective. Some of this is historiography and the different ways that historians have addressed the topic and thus the different ways in which you have been exposed to that. Some of it is in a different time with different values and different challenges. The past is going to look differently, and things that might stand out in one time period might not stand out in another. It's a one of the things you do, or certainly one of the things I do when I'm teaching I suppose sometimes undergrad, certainly graduate readings courses, is talk about what about the book that we're reading plants it very firmly in the moment that it was written, right? So his works of history that were written during the civil rights era are going to have a certain ring, a certain moral, rights-minded ring, liberal, moral, rights-minded ring, because that's the moment that people were in, and as a historian, you always have to think about that as you're writing, as you're doing your thing, as I'm, whatever it is I'm doing. I wrote a book about like violent politics. It says a lot about our time. The fact that there are other people interested in the same thing says even more about our time. But you have to address the precise thing that this question is getting at, which is how does your life experience and your thought process and what you've read and the ways in which time and evidence and understandings have changed over time, all of that adds up to whatever you have now in the moment. And it's good, right? I mean, what's better than to gain a deeper understanding over time? It's almost scary to imagine not getting a deeper understanding over time.
Yeah. Okay. Last one is a quick one from Gloria. Why was James Madison complacent?
And Gloria got us back to the founders. Thank you. I love that era. I think generally speaking, he kind of had I think that was his nature. He kind of had this philosophical bent, he could stand back and he was, he did like sort of seeing patterns, and he knew, like anyone else in the period, that he was a founder. But somehow or other, he was able to have that detachment. And again, I think, there's a reason why he was the guy doing the political combat for Jefferson. Jefferson was emotional and wrapped up in it. Madison, not that he wasn't wrapped up in it, but he had the ability to be detached and sort of plant something in the fight and then step out. So I think part of it is his nature, more than anything. I do think that, again, as I've said from the outset, some of this has to do with history and how we understand it. And some of it has to do with us and who we are at a given moment and how that shapes how we understand the past.
Yeah.
Okay, we
We did it. We cleared the deck and it's only 2 after. Good job.
Okay,
We did it.
excellent. Okay, so and I'm really, I see people in chat talking about the shingles vaccine, and I'm really not going to talk about that. At any rate, what I do want to talk about is what's going to happen now. So now we are going to go to the after party. What that means is that we will no longer be recording what's going on here. So what we just did is recorded and will get posted and archived online so that you or anyone else can see it down the road. But the after party, what happens in the after party stays in the after party. We don't record it. And what that means is we can talk about whatever the heck we want to talk about. And you know, not that we were very formal now, but we can be even less formal during the after party. If you are watching us from Facebook, you need to leave Facebook to join the after party. You need to go to ncheteach.org/conversations, ncheteach.org/conversations, and you go find the link to History Matters, and poof, you will be in the after party. That was a one-handed poof. You will be in.
A bunch of people just got bingo.
I just saw that. I just saw bingo, bingo, bingo. If
So
anyone
funny.
is new here, people play bingo based on what I say, and poof is pretty predictable. At any rate, so those of you who are going to stick around, please do. Those are wonderful conversations. Who the heck knows where we'll go? Those of you who aren't sticking around, and actually those of you who are sticking around too, as ever, thank you for taking part in this conversation in this community, which is one of many conversations of democracy, the ability to process and think and evaluate and question what's happening. There we go. History, the hands of history. So it matters, whatever size our group is, it matters that not only that we are doing this, but that we feel able to do this, that we are free and open to do this and to ask questions about whatever the heck we want to ask questions about, and to disagree with each other in a setting where you can have that kind of disagreement. That's one of the good things about this community that we should hang on to. Okay, so thank you all for being here. Have a wonderful, wonderful week. Those of you who are heading off, I have absolutely no idea, as ever, what I'll talk about next week. And who knows, maybe it'll be something I watch on TV the night before. I struggle, I think for days. And then, you know, I'm a deadline woman. So the deadline comes along and I'm like, I better think of something. Bam! Okay, I'll do it now. I want to thank Annie and John, as ever, for being here, for being a part of this community, for making all of this possible. And historian brain, and the hands of history can join historian brain. At any rate, I want to thank you guys for being here. It would not be here without you guys. So you are appreciated.
Yeah. All right. We're waiting for that Facebook to turn off and the recording. I just put a link in there to the Bunk article about Nebraska.